Countless German troops disembarked from the railway cars, bracing themselves for shackles, barred cells, and hostile mobs. That's what propaganda had promised them America would deliver. Yet what greeted them was the aroma of sizzling breakfast meat wafting from a nearby eatery. A music machine pumped out Glenn Miller tunes. Young ones gestured warmly as though welcoming visitors rather than adversaries, and their sentries strolled behind them leisurely, weapons lowered, as though escape was an absurd notion. For soldiers who anticipated capture would bring suffering, this reception proved more bewildering than combat itself. What made America extend such treatment to its foes? And in what ways did this experience transform these soldiers permanently? Continue watching to discover the answers. And if you're passionate about overlooked narratives from the Second World War, be sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and back the channel so we can deliver more hidden history. October 1943, the Atlantic stretched in unending steel gray. Transport convoys pushed westward beneath a veil of tension, crammed into the bellies of cargo vessels and repurposed military transports. Thousands of German captives seized in North Africa and Sicily prepared themselves for whatever awaited across the waters. Close to 150,000 Axis troops had given up during the Tunisian defeat earlier that year, and the Allies lacked sufficient space to contain them all in Europe. America, with its sprawling interior, would serve as their holding ground. The soldiers anticipated the bleakest outcome. For many weeks, Nazi messaging had convinced them that falling into American hands meant deprivation, iron restraints, and degradation. One Wehrmacht corporal later recounted, "We murmured amongst ourselves that they would assault us, strip our hair, and confine us beneath the earth. The ocean seemed preferable to imprisonment." His statement reflected the mentality of troops conditioned to believe they were heading toward torment. The voyage itself held its dangers. German submarines stalked the shipping corridors, and those who made it across could recall the stench of petroleum and brine, the harsh cry of warnings when sonar signals suggested threats lurking below. Every groan of the vessel sounded like our doom, one remembered. Yet no undersea missile struck them. The Gray Fleet pressed forward, shielded by escort ships bound for harbors like Newport News, Norfolk, and Boston. When the vessels reached port, anticipation crashed into contradiction. Rather than batons or chains, there were disciplined queues, military officers guiding them with sharp instructions, yet absent of brutality. They were funneled into waiting locomotives, the scent of burning coal and heated steel replacing ocean air. For countless men, it marked their initial uninterrupted glimpse of America. Verdant pastures rushing past, farmsteads untouched, no debris, no devastation. The vision disturbed them. One private scribbled in a concealed journal, "We observed livestock grazing peacefully, fences upright, women pinning clothes to dry. How is this nation engaged in warfare? Our hamlets lie in cinders." The incredulity was tangible even before they arrived at the detention facilities. The terrain itself contradicted the Reich story. In Texas, the grassland breeze carried grit and the hum of insects as trains deposited their human freight at compound entrances. Razor wires sparkled, watchtowers rose high, but the captives noticed elements that unsettled them even more. Sleeping quarters with glass panes, supply stores dispensing provisions, even playing fields being prepared. This wasn't a dungeon. The contradiction intensified when sentries addressed them in straightforward tones, absent of malice. "Form lines, gather your bedding, you'll receive clothing." It was procedure, not retribution. One sergeant muttered in astonishment, "This isn't a jail. It's a settlement." The troops were shocked to learn they would be dressed, nourished, and sheltered under regulations inscribed not by impulse but by international agreement. The Geneva Convention of 1929, scarcely familiar to most conscripts, would govern their detention. The Americans possessed both the means and the determination to honor it. The figures themselves carried weight. By late 1943, nearly 300,000 captives had reached the United States, and that count would surge past 370,000 before the war's conclusion. Detention centers spread from California's arid regions to New England's wooded areas. But the nation's midsection, Texas, Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma shouldered the heaviest load. The disbelief of those initial hours never abandoned many of them. "We anticipated being handled like creatures," one documented later. "Instead, we were handled like human beings." Yet arrival marked only the start. What unfolded in the following days, the recording of fingerprints, the distribution of prison garb, the rhythmic pattern of compound existence, would expose just how distinctly this conflict would be recalled on American territory. The initial destination for most captured Germans on American ground wasn't a compound in rural landscapes, but an intake facility. Military installations in Virginia, New Jersey, and Louisiana became gateways, where confused troops were converted from enemy combatants into catalogued prisoners of war. The rhythm of typing machines resonated through extensive timber halls, interrupted by the press of fingerprint ink devices. Each individual was documented, assigned a number, photographed, and given rough cotton clothing stamped with bold black markings. PW. The contradiction intensified. Rather than being stripped bare and bound, they received footwear, hosiery, and even grooming blades. "We could groom ourselves each dawn," one captive recalled with disbelief. "In the wasteland we had existed like wild things. In confinement we appeared like servicemen once more." The irony cut deep. Imprisonment afforded them a self-respect the crumbling Wehrmacht could no longer supply. The Americans weren't making things up as they went. Their methods adhered to the 1929 Geneva Convention, an international accord signed by most significant nations, including Germany and the United States. It ensured that captives would obtain nourishment equivalent to American forces, availability of healthcare, protection from harm, and even the privilege to dispatch and obtain correspondence. In reality, not every regulation was flawlessly followed, but the structure itself amazed prisoners who'd been convinced they would face beatings and hunger. Supervision originated from the Provost Marshal General's office, a division of the U.S. Army charged with handling hundreds of thousands of detainees. Compounds were arranged like compact military communities, barracks and orderly lines, dining facilities, general stores, and sporting grounds. German commissioned ranks were frequently segregated from regular troops, a division meant to diminish indoctrination and preserve discipline. Certain detainees were selected for different reasons. At Fort Hunt, Virginia, identified only by the mysterious designation P.O. Box 1142, chosen prisoners possessing technical expertise, submarine commanders, researchers, or senior staff underwent questioning in isolation. They endured prolonged inquiry sessions. Yet even in this place, those who lived through it observed that cruelty was nowhere to be found. "They questioned us with composure, offering tea and tobacco," a naval technician remembered decades afterward. "It proved more disturbing than aggression." The vast majority, though, never encountered Fort Hunt. They were dispatched to the interior, to vast compounds encircled by barbed barriers and observation posts built to contain thousands. Locomotives rolled through darkness, prisoners gazing through slim openings at a territory that appeared untouched by conflict. Grain fields extended endlessly. Communities still illuminated their central avenues after dark, while back in Germany, blackout fabric suffocated every light source. The statistics alone were overwhelming. By early 1944, the United States accommodated almost 350 detention centers distributed across 46 states. Some contained merely a few hundred individuals. Others, like Camp Hearn in Texas or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, held upwards of 4,000 captives apiece. The organizational challenge was enormous, but the apparatus operated with administrative exactness. Within hours of arrival, prisoners found routines that reflected military existence. Morning assemblies at sunrise, dining in communal halls, designated tasks for compound upkeep. Grievances were acknowledged, occasionally even resolved. "We submitted a formal complaint about the bread lacking firmness," one captive chuckled later. 7 days later it had more crust. Picture our amazement that they responded. The difference with Germany's handling of captured Americans or Soviets wasn't overlooked by the troops. Communications from Stalingrad survivors described famine, sickness, and casual killing. Now seated in timber barracks with heating stoves, some experienced a guilt that troubled them as deeply as longing for home. Still, wariness remained. Certain prisoners whispered this was deception, that tolerance would shift to harshness. But weeks extended into months and the pattern persisted. Uniforms, food portions, even Sunday religious gatherings were allowed. Gradually disbelief crystallized into hesitant confidence. What followed next would extend that confidence even more, for in America's interior the contradiction grew sharper. The adversary would shortly be escorted beyond his compound, past razor wire and guard stations, and onto the avenues of common communities without restraints. By the winter of 1943, whispers traveled through the wire-enclosed areas. Certain prisoners would be permitted beyond the gates. Hardly anyone accepted it. In Germany, detainees were confined like wild beasts. To move among ordinary people seemed unthinkable. Yet one cold dawn in Texas, the entrance swung wide, and groups of Germans marched forward under the observation of several armed sentries. No iron bonds clattered, boots struck gravel without restriction. The contradiction was instantaneous. They were adversaries in military dress, though bearing the large PW stenciled on their torsos. Yet they moved through American communities as though they were workers on leave. Sentries maintained a courteous gap, firearms carried loosely to the captives' astonishment. Citizens scarcely gawked. Agricultural workers tipped their headwear. Business proprietors lingered in entryways. A journal entry from a Bavarian draftee preserved the wonder. We were marched toward the settlement. I assumed they would bind our wrists. Instead we walked casually. We witnessed youngsters enjoying sweet confections. A young girl gestured in greeting. It resembled awakening from torment into an alternative existence. The sensory impact overwhelmed them. The scent of breakfast pork drifted from an eating establishment. A wireless device broadcast Glenn Miller's melodies from a pharmacy display. Publications slapped against walkways as young vendors called out news. In Germany, thoroughfares smelled of powder and haze. Here it was brewed coffee and fuel vapors. Initially, prisoners anticipated deception. Would they be displayed for mockery? Yet there existed no taunting assembly, no humiliation. Not one person, someone recalled with wonder. The sentries walked at our rear, not ahead of us. They didn't restrain us because they believed we wouldn't flee. And remarkably, we didn't. Confidence proved the concealed instrument. Flight was achievable. The countryside stretched for vast distances and several attempted it, but the majority remained. Where would they venture? America was excessively enormous, its citizens excessively watchful, and the sentries, though at ease, possessed authority. The liberty was emblematic, not total. Yet for troops trained to anticipate violence, it was staggering. Numbers show how routine these excursions became. By 1944, tens of thousands of captives were consistently escorted into communities across Texas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota to conduct work or even purchase goods at sanctioned establishments. Compound administrators documented escape percentages below 1%, significantly less than anticipated. The lack of restraints functioned as effectively as any iron bond. Certain residents recalled these unusual processions for generations. In Nebraska, a farmer's offspring later stated, "It was peculiar. The adversary passing our storage building like acquaintances. We children trailed them, fascinated. They didn't appear threatening. They appeared exhausted." The contradiction intensified when the prisoners contrasted the scene with what they'd been taught. Nazi messaging had depicted Americans as savage, morally corrupt, racially fractured monsters. Now they passed educational facilities intact, observed families shopping, and inhaled air absent of dread. One commissioned rank muttered with bitterness, "If Berlin learned of this, the conflict would crumble." Not everything was friendly. Certain townspeople spat or averted their gaze. Military veterans organizations objected to the approach, insisting on severer handling. Yet on the whole, the arrangement functioned, and it functioned because the display of liberty under vigilant observation penetrated more profoundly than punishment ever could. The supervised walks became simultaneously customary and enlightening. Every stride along Main Street, every hint of tobacco smoke or peek at a shop display chipped away at a worldview constructed under dictatorship. The troops remained prisoners, yet the lack of restraints communicated more about America than any pamphlet released from an aircraft. What they witnessed afterward, fields, industrial sites, and the exertion of genuine toil would connect them even more firmly to the contradiction of imprisonment absent of harshness. If the supervised walks into communities unsettled German captives, the subsequent days frequently transformed them entirely. America didn't maintain them inactive behind barriers. Rather, the nation assigned them labor. By 1944, the War Manpower Commission coordinated with the Army to channel captive workforce into the very core of the U.S. economic system. Agricultural land required harvesting. Lumber required felling. Industrial plants required workers. And with millions of American males deployed overseas, there existed voids only prisoners could occupy. The contradiction was obvious. Troops who had previously battled to demolish the United States now bent their spines to nourish it. In Texas, cotton fields extended toward the skyline, the aroma of moist soil adhering to garments. In Nebraska and Iowa, prisoners wielded tools and sugar beet patches, perspiration mingling with earth. Wisconsin dispatched them into thick woodlands where the scrape of cutting implements and the fragrance of newly cut pine occupied their senses. It was exhausting toil, yet not enslavement. Captives received compensation, not in currency they could retain, but in voucher credits exchangeable at compound supply stores. Chocolate confections, grooming supplies, tobacco products, and even correspondence materials became modest indulgences. One recalled, I accumulated more felling sugar beets in Iowa than I possessed as a combatant in North Africa. It was ridiculous, yet accurate. Statistics revealed the magnitude. By late 1945, over 425,000 captive workers in America executed more than 45 million labor days of farming work. In certain regions, German prisoners gathered as much as one-third of regional harvests. Economic analysts later acknowledged that absent captive workforce, complete harvests would have decomposed in the fields. For numerous agricultural workers, initial mistrust yielded to appreciation. They rescued our agricultural operation, one Iowa woman documented. We couldn't have collected the grain without them. Farmers frequently shared sandwiches, citrus drinks, or even homemade pastries. The Germans sampled white loaves rich with butter, sugary preserves, and meat sandwiches unlike anything remaining in their homeland. The irony was acute. Their captors nourished them superior to their own military had. The sensory differences seared into recollection. A Hessian enlisted man remembered sampling a citrus fruit for the initial time. In Germany, produce vanished by 42. Here, it resembled consuming sunshine. Others recalled the aroma of fresh brewed coffee carried in containers to the fields, more potent and fuller than substitute brew back home. Still, distrust persisted. Certain American households glared as the adversary trudged past, resentful that troops who had attempted to eliminate their offspring now labored their terrain. Veterans associations occasionally objected, charging Washington with pampering the enemy. Yet the bulk accepted the setup. The workforce was excessively crucial to disregard and the regulations excessively rigid for genuine danger. Sentries stayed present, firearms prepared, even if seldom employed. The captives themselves observed another contradiction: liberty of travel within imprisonment. Laboring in exposed fields, they could observe the heavens unobstructed, smell the changing seasons, hear the buzzing of insects or the whisper of grain stalks. Several could have fled, yet hardly any did. Where could they venture? Flight meant deprivation or recapture. Labor meant nourishment, compensation, and duration beyond the barriers. In accounts generations afterward, countless acknowledged that toil altered them more than speeches ever could. One documented, "We discovered that America's power resided not in its armaments, but in its agricultural land. Even its earth was more fertile than ours. They nourished us from abundance we couldn't conceive." And when the labor day concluded, they returned under supervision, not to restraints or deprivation, but to sleeping quarters with heated meals, communications from home, and occasionally even the melodies of Glenn Miller crackling through wireless devices. Yet the labor was merely one element of the revelation. Beyond the furrows and forests existed an even greater astonishment. The civilization of a nation that opened its book repositories, houses of worship and entertainment venues to troops who had previously vowed to annihilate it. The labor maintained German prisoners occupied, yet what remained in their consciousness were the glimpses of American existence they absorbed during those supervised outings. Every journey into the community was like stepping through a mirror. The Reich had portrayed America as degenerate, brutal, disintegrating under disorder. Yet Main Street conveyed another narrative, one of glowing signs, thriving cafes, and youngsters pedaling bicycles beneath expansive secure skies. The contradiction was striking. They were prisoners, their uniforms marked with prominent PW letters. Yet they sampled a liberty their relatives in Germany hadn't experienced in years. One enlisted man recalled, "We were adversaries, yet citizens observed us with curiosity, not hatred." It was the most significant shock of all. The sensory array dazzled them. Wireless devices and store displays broadcast Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Bing Crosby. The aroma of buttered popcorn drifted from cinema houses where advertisements for Casablanca and Yankee Doodle Dandy tempted passers-by. Grocery presentations gleamed with preserved fruit, chocolate, and coffee containers stacked toward the ceiling, indulgences absent in Europe since 1940. The plenty appeared unreal. Within the compounds, Americans promoted cultural involvement. Numerous enclosures possessed book collections stocked with English and German volumes, instruction rooms for language education, and even musical ensembles organized by musically trained prisoners. In Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, German performers played Mozart and Beethoven on instruments provided by residents. At Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners presented theatrical productions, complete with attire and painted scenery for fellow detainees and even sentries. Athletic activities flourished as well. Soccer competitions attracted hundreds of observers within the wire, while baseball became a curious new enthusiasm. "Initially we ridiculed the peculiar game," one captive confessed. "By summer we were swinging clubs." The crack of wood on leather, the aroma of powder rising from positions became part of compound recollection. Faith, too, performed its function. Chaplains, both German and American, led Sunday gatherings in improvised chapels. Hymns resonated across enclosures, voices ascending in both German and English. For troops distant from home, it was a connection to self-respect. Communications preserved their amazement. One combatant wrote to his family in Bavaria, "We are granted the opportunity to read, to study, even to perform music. We believed imprisonment would be chains. Instead, it is as though we exist in an academy." Figures emphasize the scope of this cultural encounter. By 1945, the U.S. Army had circulated more than 1 million volumes to captive compounds and arranged over 2,000 educational programs. Tens of thousands of troops departed America with superior English than they possessed upon arrival. Still, mistrust existed. Not every American embraced the concept of providing enemy combatants book repositories or musical instruments. Editorial pieces questioned why German prisoners could view films while American youths bled in Europe. Yet the military defended its approach, referencing the Geneva Convention, and to the conviction that humane handling promoted cooperation. The contradiction was powerful. Every melody heard on the wireless, every paperback publication, every baseball competition chipped away at the concept of America as a barbaric adversary. It wasn't propaganda pamphlets that shifted hearts, but the quiet, ordinary texture of existence. And yet, for all the civility, tensions simmered. Not everyone in communities smiled at the sight of uniformed Germans. Mothers who had lost offspring clenched fists. Black Americans seeing the adversary handled with self-respect whispered with bitterness about a liberty refused to them at home. The cultural exchange was genuine, but so were the divisions it exposed. What prisoners would encounter afterward in the gazes and gestures and objections of American civilians revealed even more about the contradictions of a nation at war. If the German prisoners marveled at America's plenty, Americans themselves were frequently torn at the sight of them. The responses were as diverse as the citizens. On one side, agricultural workers, factory proprietors, and industrial managers came to rely on the workforce. They observed young troops from the Reich not as monsters, but as laborers who prevented harvests from decomposing and manufacturing lines operating. After a shift in the fields, numerous farmers offered sandwiches, citrus drinks, or even portions of pastry, gestures unthinkable under the messaging that had characterized the conflict. They labored diligently, one Iowa farmer's spouse recalled. In the conclusion, we sympathized with them more than we despised them. Yet for others, the sight of enemy uniforms cut profoundly. Mothers whose offspring lay in Normandy burial grounds clenched their jaws as they observed prisoners traveling by in vehicles. Veterans in small communities occasionally spat as the captives passed. Why should they consume steak while our youths consume field rations? One communication to the publisher fumed. The contradiction was especially acute in the South. In Alabama and Texas, Black Americans noticed with bitter clarity that German prisoners, Caucasian troops who had pledged loyalty to Hitler, were permitted to dine in establishments that barred them. In certain instances, prisoners sat down to meals in locations where African Americans could only serve, not be served. One Black veteran later documented, "I battled for liberty, yet when I returned home the German captives possessed more of it than I did." This racial contradiction wasn't overlooked by the Germans. Several recorded in journals their confusion that the same nation which provided them book repositories, melodies, and pastry could refuse its own citizens fundamental privileges. For countless individuals, this hypocrisy became their most enduring impression of America. Still, generosity persisted. School youngsters occasionally gestured as prisoners marched past under supervision. In uncommon moments, households left containers of produce at the roadside for them. At Christmas, church congregations sent presents of candy, tobacco, or hosiery into compounds. One prisoner recalled opening a package labeled simply "from a companion." Mistrust remained, naturally. Whispers spread that Nazis would damage industrial plants or contaminate water sources. Sentries maintained firearms ready, even if seldom raised, and in certain locations objections erupted, small demonstrations demanding severer handling. Yet violence was uncommon. America had chosen to combat its adversary with plenty, not deprivation. The figures tell a quiet narrative. By 1945, fewer than 1% of captives in U.S. custody attempted flight, and almost all were recaptured rapidly. Why flee when the territory beyond the barriers appeared less like enemy ground and more like a realm of baffling generosity? The contradiction intensified. America was ruthless in conflict, leveling urban centers in Germany and Japan. Yet within its boundaries, it extended to enemy combatants a measure of humanity that astonished them. That contradiction, violence abroad, civility domestically, lodged itself in the recollections of the captured, and it established the foundation for what followed. When the conflict concluded and the barriers opened, numerous Germans carried back to Europe not just narratives of hard toil, but recollections of America's contradictions, generosity, and cultural richness. The contradiction of liberty within imprisonment was preserved not only in recollection, but in written words. Every German prisoner was entitled under the Geneva Convention to write communications home, 2 monthly, censored but intact. Those communications, hundreds of thousands of them, carried astonishment across the Atlantic. Dear L., one prisoner scribbled in late 1944, I am taken to the community without restraints. There are establishments, automobiles, melodies. I don't comprehend it. His words were trimmed by the censor's pencil, yet the shock still leaked through. Compound newsletters, frequently edited by prisoners themselves, became another channel of testimony. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, Germans published Der Zaungast, the fence guest. Inside its reproduced pages were verses, essays, even small illustrations. Several praised American generosity. Others wrestled with the guilt of defeat. To the sentries and commissioned ranks who permitted its printing, the newsletter was harmless. To researchers, it became a window into the prisoners' conflicted souls. Oral testimonies generations later reveal even sharper astonishment. A former Africa Corps commissioned rank interviewed in 1983 recalled, "We marched through the community, the firearms pointed downward. I believed it deception. In Germany, a prisoner is restrained. In America, a prisoner moves freely." Accounts confirm the sensory strangeness of that liberty. The clatter of dining establishment plates, the aroma of fuel on wide American thoroughfares, the flavor of Coca-Cola, all remained in recollections documented years afterward. For troops who had marched through wastelands or frozen steppes, the sweetness of a carbonated beverage in a compound supply store was an unforgettable puzzle. Nearly 425,000 German captives had to be returned in stages, initially to Britain or France for workforce duty and only afterward to a shattered Germany. For countless individuals, departing was harder than arriving. In account after account, troops confessed they dreaded departure. One prisoner at Camp Aliceville admitted, "I wished the locomotive would never arrive. I possessed bread, melodies, even self-respect here. At home there was debris." Another recalled stepping off the vessel in Bremerhaven in 1946 and experiencing a shock at the hunger, the cold, the gaunt faces of civilians. The legacy of those unchained walks into American communities rippled outward. Several returned to Germany determined to reconstruct a society on the model they had glimpsed: open markets, democratic discourse, even jazz and baseball. Others carried darker recollections of racial contradictions that revealed America's deficiencies. "They provided us liberty in chains," one documented, yet refused it to their own citizens of color. The contradiction endured, and yet narratives of generosity multiplied. Agricultural workers who once employed captives received communications from Germany years afterward: gratitude for a sandwich, a cordial word, a Christmas present. Several former prisoners returned after the conflict, immigrating to the very territory that had captured them. By the 1950s, veterans of both sides occasionally met again, not as adversaries but as acquaintances. Statistically, the experiment had been astonishingly stable. Fewer than memorable incidents occurred. Figures confirm the scope of this documented astonishment. By 1945, more than 350,000 communications monthly were dispatched from captive compounds across America to Germany, Switzerland, or Red Cross relay stations. Even through censorship, the message of contradiction reached households. Their offspring were not starved or restrained but laboring, dining, and even studying. Several communications turned bitter in tone. "I observe a territory of plenty," one combatant admitted, "and I question why we were informed it was corrupt." For troops raised in the shadow of Nazi messaging, the contradiction gnawed at their identity. Was the Reich's promise of superiority merely a falsehood? For Americans who read intercepted correspondence or later heard accounts, the impact was equally acute. They realized their own ordinary acts, offering nourishment, permitting prisoners to move into communities, had become instruments of truth, not propaganda but lived reality. As the war's conclusion drew near, these voices grew stronger. Compounds organized choirs, art displays, and English instruction, leaving cultural records that blurred the line between captor and captive. The voices captured in communications and accounts ensured that what happened in those unchained walks and small community encounters would not vanish with the closing of the compounds. Yet the greatest test came with repatriation. Would these recollections survive the voyage home or dissolve in the ruins of a shattered Germany? The weapons fell silent in May 1945. Yet for the prisoners in America, the conflict didn't conclude at once. Locomotives still rolled across the continent, transporting troops to harvests in Iowa, cotton fields in Texas, and logging operations in the Northwest. Repatriation was a vast logistical undertaking. Fewer than forgettable incidents occurred. Figures confirm the magnitude of this recorded astonishment. By 1945, more than 350,000 communications monthly were dispatched from captive compounds across America to Germany, Switzerland, or Red Cross relay stations. Even through censorship, the message of contradiction reached households. Their offspring were not starved or restrained but laboring, dining, and even studying. Fewer than 1,000 flight attempts were made across the entire conflict, and almost all failed. Violence between prisoners and sentries was uncommon. What endured instead was a recollection of a nation powerful enough to combat ruthlessly abroad, yet confident enough to handle its adversaries with a strange decency domestically. The contradiction came full circle. German combatants had crossed the Atlantic anticipating chains, harshness, and deprivation. They found instead pastry on farmhouse tables, music machines humming Glenn Miller, and communities that let them move unrestrained under vigilant yet distant observation. They had arrived as conquerors. They departed as pupils. In the conclusion, America's greatest instrument was not its explosives, but its abundance.